symbolic coming from Ashok, right? We need to understand first things first off the bat, right? This is like context, substantive, and rebuttal all mixed into one, just like Nescafe. Like, what is this concept of sexual harassment? Like, he pointed out this whole idea about how women are tortured on an almost daily basis, and how this has driven people almost to the brink of suicide or like cutting themselves. Like, understandably, right? I'm not denying that these cases do happen. They do happen, but they happen to very isolated cases of people who don't have the mental constitution to address the kind of harassment that they face. Largely, the large swaths of cases when talking about sexual harassment, what are they? We're talking about when your employer goes out there and makes a pass on you consistently, almost every day, flirts with you, talks about how short your skirt is, leans over, tries to like catch a sight of your bum, right? The kind of feeling of great discomfort that you get in working or trying to relate to that individual and working in that particular area. The kind of feeling that you get when Aji tries to talk to you over the breaks between debates. Like, we think, right, that the harms when you're talking about sexual harassment is more analogous to the harms of things like slander and libel, which affects the emotions of an individual, which affect the fuller conception of how he wants to perceive his life. We don't think it's analogous to things like rape or murder, the way he hyperbolically, I can't remember what the word is, like how the way he tried to hype it up in his speech. Again, because when you're talking about things like rape and murder, which are legitimately criminal charges, it deals with the violation of fundamental liberties of the individual that the state has a compelling interest to govern. And that's the difference, right? But let's deal with like a couple of rebuttals that you have. Yeah. Like, firstly, like his legal test, why this is like a criminal charge. Like, there are three ones, right? Firstly, he said, you know what, this makes you feel unsafe. Like, you know, this helps, it affects the way society perceives you, and like, therefore, because of the cultural impacts, it needs to be elevated into a criminal charge. We think things like slander and libel, we think things like, for example, medical negligence, similarly cultivates a culture of fear as well. Like, things, for example, medical negligence, broaches the idea that, you know, people might fear like being at the hands of doctors who might unnecessarily perform procedures that they don't want upon them, right? Like, but we don't see the state necessarily elevating that into a criminal charge. Then his second test was the idea that, you know, if it hurts and harms you, it should be criminal negligence. But again, medical negligence hurts and harms you as well, but we don't see that elevated as a criminal charge. Like, so what is the idea here, and how do you identify a criminal charge? Because we think when you're talking about civil matters, it's predicated on a personal contract between two individuals, on your legitimate expectations in that corporation. And we think on the back of that, right, we believe that things like sexual harassment merely undermines this contract that the employee has with the employer. I'll probably further elucidate later. Then went to the second idea, right, this concept, you know, there are disproportionate forces, like, you know, the employer is going out there and harassing the employee and she has no remedy out. Like, two responses. The first response is that this is not the 18th, sorry, one response. This is not the 18th century, right? We think like the employee has been greatly empowered by laws that govern the rights of employees in these instances. Even when you try to limit it to India, we think in India there are several multinational corporations. They are influenced by international standards. They are influenced by corporations in their home countries, which ensure that the standards are met. We think this is a work in progress, and we don't think it's necessarily a problem that we're facing. We think we just need to empower these women via education even more. Like the third idea, right, he said, you know, we need to get the CEO down so she has a hand on this. Like, that's rubbish, right? When it comes to civil proceedings, there are things called vicarious liability, where you can necessarily also sue the employer for not coming down and being responsible for the behaviors of the people directly under their charge. We don't think it's just exclusive to their concept of criminal charges. And the last idea of facing public backlash, this is a non-starter. Public backlash is idea shared by both sides, right? Even for civil proceedings, people won't necessarily fire individuals because of public backlash. We don't think it's just exclusive to them. But before that, after that, let's go to the points I have. Now, I have two substantive points, right? Firstly, why the state has no compelling interest, and secondly, the detriments. Under the first point, why the state has no compelling interest, I have three sub-points. Let's talk about the first idea, right? We think, first and foremost, that the state doesn't legislate upon emotions, right? And that's precisely what this is. When it comes to sexual harassment, it predominantly deals with the emotions of an individual. That's why the state doesn't elevate slander and libel charges up to a criminal charge. And the reason for this is simple. When you're talking about criminal law, it needs the certainty of legal tests. But when you rely on things, for example, so subjective as how an individual may feel that day, like we think this broaches greatly the idea of certainty in criminal law, and this is important because it undermines the personal liberty of the accused persons in these proceedings. Because if he doesn't know what exactly is the standard that he's supposed to adhere to, how exactly is he supposed to ensure that he adheres to the laws of the country and doesn't toll that threshold that he's not supposed to toll? And the second substantive point I have is that the state has no locus standi in this instance. When you're talking about things like rape and murder, there are contraventions of an individual's fundamental liberties enshrined in the constitution of their country. Therefore, the state has the paramount mandate to ensure that the fundamental liberties of an individual are taken care of. But when you're talking about things like sexual harassment, which deals predominantly with emotion, we think what this does is that it pertains primarily to the individual contract between the employee and the employer. And it's something that the state has left to the individual's calculus, right? Like, because they recognize the limited harm when it comes to sexual harassment, they leave it up to the individual whether they think it's a serious enough issue to undergo civil proceedings and bear all that cost just to prove a point. We think when you subpoena that woman and force her, drag her down to court when she doesn't necessarily think it might be as bad as you want it to be, we think that's unfair and unjust upon the individual. I'll take you off the third point. And the third point, right, this concept of like the cultural idea, like that we don't think that the state has a compelling interest in this instance because it doesn't create any specific culture when it comes to sexual harassment. They're very excited. I'm going to take them on this point. Go.
Does slander lead to depression?
Yes. Ask Lee Kuan Yew. Like, he's severely depressed every time the review goes up. I'm serious. It's in the court papers, like, swear to God. But beyond that, we think slander and libel, especially when it comes to public figures, does undermine the individual's credibility and reputation in carrying out his official capacity as a politician or as a public figure. We think the fact that it inhibits them greatly could also potentially lead to depression for these individuals. We think the test that they're talking about is amorphous. Then the second idea, right, this concept of the detriment. We have two subpoints to this. The first subpoint is this concept of double jeopardy. Like, what they're doing is that they're maintaining a civil and criminal avenue for the individual, which directly contravenes an individual not to be tried twice for the same issue. Because what they're obviously advocating for here is the idea that once the individual has been prosecuted criminally, that the woman still has the capacity to sue that person in a civil court. We think this is massively unfair because that individual is paying dues for the same crime to two different actors. And we think when you're talking about the fundamental rules of natural justice in the country, we think an individual needs to be protected from such insidious elements. On the second idea, we think it makes them far more unemployable in the current status than the current status quo. We understand already with the presence of civil proceedings, what happens is that most women don't necessarily become the optimum or priorities for employers. The moment you elevate it into something like a criminal charge, it's going to turn off more people from hiring these women, especially since the test is so uncertain on their part, because they're not sure when necessarily they're going to contravene the test and find themselves criminally liable. And for these reasons, and because RG, please stop making passes at me, I'm extremely proud to all.